Welcome to the Linen Suit and Plastic Tie podcast. This is the podcast where we dissect, analyze, investigate, inspect, dissect some more the amazing, the epic, the incredible, the awe-inspiring, the awestruck, inspiring, the epic again, the amazing power of storytelling. I'm Gaurav.
And I'm Kevin.
I gotta keep a synonym list for those words somewhere. It's getting weird. I think I said awestruck, inspiring at some point. I don't know if you've ever seen the show The Good Place. It's starring Kristen Bell, Ted Danson. It's a show about moral philosophy, written as a comedy, created by Mike Schur. And there's a line where the two of the stars, Chidi and Eleanor played by Kristen Bell, Chidi is telling Eleanor this story just about this librarian that gave him some advice. The librarian essentially gave Chidi advice to help Eleanor, and he was telling the story about how this happened. And then Eleanor says, "Yes, go sexy librarian." Then Chidi says, "I never said he was sexy." And then Eleanor says, "Yeah, but anytime anyone tells me a story, I imagine everyone being extremely sexy because otherwise I lose interest." And then she turns to him and says, "You know you can do that for free, right?" And it's just a moment in television where I'm like, it's such a good analogy for storytelling and education, if you really think about it. Because it's this idea that we talk about a lot on the show about how it's your job to tell it in a compelling and interesting way. So by adding a little bit storytelling, and in this scenario, the audience is doing it themselves, but by adding a little bit storytelling, you can make information so much stickier and so much more interesting and so much more digestible just because you went through the extra step and saying, how can I make it interesting, right? For Eleanor, she does it herself and she adds that everyone in the story is going to be extremely sexy. And that's how she's going to digest it. And this is the power of storytelling. And I think Mike Schur is a great example of this as a storyteller because he also wrote a book on moral philosophy that I'm reading. And the show's about moral philosophy. It's a show like The West Wing where by watching it, by following the stories, you can learn something. The West Wing taught me a lot about civics. The Good Place taught me a lot about philosophy if you watch it in that way. And I think that this is the thing about education that gets missed sometimes is that there's an exciting space right now with things like masterclass and shows like this where we have this new field of edutainment where you can educate people in an exciting way. You don't get extra credit for reading the 10,000 page philosophy book that you don't understand. But if you can teach someone something about like Aristotle in a digestible way, that's the amazing power of education. That is something that we need to find a way to do, and tools like AI can empower that.
Also, just for this season, we actually talked to someone who does that, right? Prof. Noctis, who teaches religious theory using video games. And one of the newest and latest storytelling mediums is allowing students to better digest and understand some of the oldest stories we have in our history because of the incorporation of new technology and new storytelling mediums.
I think that might be our early takeaway or early thought process for this episode. How can you make it sexy? How can you make what you're saying sexy? How can you make education interesting? How can you meet your students at their level? Technology gives us so many opportunities for that. And I think that is the real challenge for educators.
Speaking of educational innovation, today we are talking to Isabelle Hau, who is the executive director at Stanford Accelerator for Learning, who has dedicated her entire career in early childhood education, as well as education impact investing. And we're going to talk to Isabelle about not only her own early childhood education story, but also what she has found working in this field for decades, as well as her new book that's coming out soon, Love to Learn. It is a great conversation that inspires us to rethink our relationship with technology and also the nature of our education system.
I'm also going to say this now. I'm starting this as a societal push. We should make every comedy writer write a book with an academic. That should be the new rule. If you want to be a successful comedy writer, you have to write a book with an academic. Because I think they work out really well based on the one I read. All right, let's get into it.
Hello, How do you do? Sit down, gather around. We've got stories about stories that'll mix you a drink of wonder and mystique. Cause life can be dry, better dressed for the times with the linen suit and plastic tie. Linen suit and plastic tie. Now here's Gaurav and Kevin.
So, to get us started, Isabelle, can you tell us a little bit about yourself? What is your story?
Yeah. So I've always been drawn to education as a powerful lever for change, both personally and societally, especially in the early years. And of course, there is a personal story behind it. Early childhood education literally changed my life. So when I was 3 years old, my parents had me tested simply because I was a late walker, I was a late speaker, I was a late everything at that time. And they received a result that no parent wants ever to receive. The result essentially said that I would have very low academic aptitude, which is in essence meant very low prospects in the rest of my life. And, long story short, I would end up graduating from Harvard University, and I now work and lead the Stanford Accelerator for Learning. So all of this is behind me. But really what made a huge difference is early childhood education. So I not only benefited from the deep love and care from my parents, who really sought all the attention they could for me, but also vividly remember how the huge impact that both early care and especially childcare settings that I was enrolled in at age 3, and then later on the preschool that I got into really made a difference. So that's really the personal story behind it, where early childhood education had such an impact. And I've often reflected on it. How can I ensure that every child on this planet has access to the same opportunities that I did? So that's where I made this focus the core of my own career in philanthropy, in impact investing, and now in academia, where I've had really the privilege of working with countless number of visionary educators, innovators, and many communities who have dedicated their work to building a brighter future.
Such a beautiful story. Thank you so much for sharing that with us. You were kind of told this thing as a kid, or your parents were, and then you went on to have obviously this beautiful career and focused on education and all these like amazing accolades. Like you mentioned, you got your MBA from Harvard Business School, which is not an easy feat. But do you think being told that so young maybe put a chip on your shoulder, like gave you something to prove that you've been kind of actively fighting against? Because I know I have those stuff all the time, where someone tells me something and then I start out of spite almost fighting against it. But do you feel like it gave you a chip on your shoulder, something you felt like you had to prove?
So that's a really good question, Gaurav, and I think that I feel really lucky from that perspective because my parents largely protected me from it, making me feel like there was nothing wrong and nothing, that everything was really normal course of action. And as a child, you don't know anything else. You think that what you get is what everyone, it's a normal path. So it's really more in retrospect as I was reflecting on these different experiences and what really made a difference that I had the opportunity to realize how lucky I was. But again, my parents really normalized it tremendously, not making me feel like I was different from any other child.
That's the best way. But it's so important to share stories like this, right? Because something we talk about on the show a lot is, we over index on the one in a million stories. Like we over index on the prodigy, the youth prodigy that kind of hit it big or got lucky. And when we don't share stories like this, we don't share stories of adversity and early issues that it causes us to feel like failures very early. So like sharing your story and telling people like this is how I started and I pushed through and it's possible. It's so important to motivate young learners.
Yes, no, absolutely. And also, of course, a big question that maybe some of the listeners may have, and I also have in some ways, is what is the validity of these early tests? And especially when, was it a false positive? Although in my case, I think this may, there were a lot of signals that suggested that it may not have been. But when do you not let a particular test impact the rest of your life, but rather take it as an opportunity to receive the appropriate supports and interventions and love and nurturing care that is appropriate for your particular case? Yeah.
This is a really interesting question, actually, of are we over-testing our youth? Are we becoming too obsessed with the story of grades?
This is actually the core topic of my book that I'm just in the process of writing, called Love to Learn, where essentially the big thesis, or one of the big theses, is that I would like to see what I called relational intelligence, or RQ, substitute GPAs and testing. Right now we are in an education system that essentially has been built about 200 years ago for a number of reasons that were largely driven by historical artifact of the mass industrialization. And so our education system is acting largely as a sorting mechanism, with grades being one of the big determinants of that. Our education systems have not been built around learning. And how can we, over time, refocus on the essence of, I think, what we want our education systems to be in the future, which is learning. And learning is, for all of us human beings, a very social process.
Yeah.
Which is why I'm advocating for this concept of relational intelligence, which I think is a much more powerful concept than GPA. This concept of how can we build education systems that are a lot more relational and focused on relationships among humans to ensure that people grow and learn.
For your journey into actually deciding, okay, I'm going to work in early childhood education as my own career, how did that transition went down for you? And once you got in, are there some surprising facts that challenge your notion of education before you actually went in?
Yeah, so I focused on education all my career, but I really had an opportunity now about 15 years ago to really focus almost exclusively on education. I was working for this amazing organization called Omidyar Network at the time, and I was focused on philanthropy and impact investing. And then as the organization started growing, we decided to become more and more specialized in some sub areas, education being one of them. So that's when I started with some of my colleagues the education practice at Omidyar Network that became then subsequently Imaginable Futures.
Looking into your impact investing, how do you measure impact? How do you measure success in the startups that come to you?
So at the startup level, there are 3 levels of impact that we were tracking. One is reach, so the number of people that a startup ends up impacting. 2 is depth, so how much of a particular startup is changing someone's life. So you can reach a lot of people, but be very, very, have an intervention that's, modest in terms of impact or not, or have tremendous level of depth. So the depth of an intervention or solution is very important. So that's a number 2. And 3, which often is ignored because it's very difficult to measure, is what we call the Omidyar Network influence. And it might actually be the greatest lever of change. So let me give an example of an organization that I had invested in the early years, Wonder School, which is an innovative model in childcare. So which would be, number of little ones and maybe educators that this organization has impacted. Depth is what are the benefits in terms of learning outcomes that we can measure and track for any one of those little learners. And influence would be what are the policy changes or what are the replications of this model that we are seeing, where we can say that this organization, Wonder School, has impacted more broadly the field at large.
You bring up a lot of very interesting points there. And I love this idea of like, okay, how can we use this kind of venture, social entrepreneurship, impact investing mindset on education, right? Especially because we're in this explosion of technology. Kevin and I both graduated college in the pandemic. Our last quarter of college was in the pandemic. We experienced how education changed immediately. And I think out of the pandemic, a lot of people are embracing technology. And now we obviously have the ChatGPT large language model AI boom, right, in education. And it brings all this promise of technology. And there was a lot of talk during the pandemic about how technology was an equalizer for education. It brought a lot of people shared educational experiences. But there was something you had talked about in a speech or a panel or something about the AI I found really fascinating. This idea of we can easily get into a world where the rich people, the 1%, will have real human tutors and real human interactions. And we just put AI on the poorer communities. And they can have AI tutors, which will broaden the divide. I really wanted to dive into that. How have you seen technology been used in the pandemic, and how can we avoid a future where we allow it to be a greater divide in education?
Yeah, so we had this massive experiment of trying technology in education. Unfortunately, it was a massive failure in many ways. Because a lot of kids are unfortunately behind where they were on an average basis relative to pre-pandemic. And then, as we know, the pandemic also has created some huge other issues regarding mental health and social emotional outcomes. So in many ways, the technology experiment of COVID is not considered necessarily a good one. I think we have a new opportunity in front of us with this new wave of artificial intelligence, as you pointed out, which is another massive experiment happening in education as we speak, because it's by far the fastest technology adoption that we've ever seen in our mankind, faster than the internet, faster than any social media. Both learners and educators are adopting this technology, and parents, by the way, are adopting this technology very rapidly. So we have an opportunity based on this wave of adoption to do something amazing, I hope, but it has yet to be seen. Right now, a lot of the usage, a lot of the initial data that we are gathering in research are very mixed. Some suggest that it's not only really equitable, so meaning the kids who are underperforming the most are benefiting the most. So that's promising.
Mm-hmm.
At the same time, there are some massive biases and other inequities that are rising out of this massive adoption of AI in schools and in families.
Obviously, you live in the tech capital of the world. You're at Stanford. You're in impact investing. So you are inundated by every new technology education idea. How do you deal with that? How do you balance all this excitement around technology with trying to hold people and be like, technology is great, scale is great, but there's something innately human that's hard to explain?
Yes. Thank you. Thank you, Dora. This is at the essence of what I believe. So at Stanford, we have a beautiful expression for AI. We want to see artificial intelligence to be human-centered. I would actually push this even further. I would like all these technologies to really be in service of human connections. I think that a lot of tech is what I call junk tech, especially for young kids. At the same time, there are a lot of tech that's amazing, really increasing our capacity as humans to relate to others. And that's what I call relational tech. And I make them in opposition to each other because I would like to see more relational tech and less junk tech. So, for example, an example of relational tech that we are working on at Stanford right now, one is a project that we call Google Glass. So Google glasses are these devices that's powered by machine learning and computer vision that detects through image recognition the patterns of emotions. And those are being deployed for young children who are on the autism spectrum. So imagine a child wearing those Google glasses, detecting for the first time the emotion of the adult, and often it's a parent, across from them. It is a beautiful, very powerful use of technology that enhance human connections. Or another example in the early years is a tool that my colleague Dr. Phil Fisher has been developing at the Stanford Center on Early Childhood called Find, which is a video coaching tool between a child and an adult. A little bit like in sports when you play baseball or golf and you get those video on your craft. Similar here, you get a video back on your parenting, essentially, and highlighting the special moments of interactions between an adult and a child. But the problem is that for a long time there was we needed a lot of human to analyze all this video footage of those interactions, so very expensive and very lengthy to get that feedback back to the parent. So with machine learning, we are now able to pinpoint much faster on what are the special moments of interaction and give that feedback to the adult. So very powerful use of technology, again, that doesn't displace in any way human connections. If anything, it empowers parents to be better parents, as opposed to junk tech that would be further isolating young children and addicting them to the realm of their screens.
The storytelling aspect of that is so important. Like the storytelling aspect behind technology and the intention of it. I think, when I was in high school, my school had this program with this public school for kids with disabilities, specifically kids with cerebral palsy. It was called Sunnyview School, and my school was a very privileged school, and we had a big robotics program, and we built toys for kids with cerebral palsy. And I remember I built this one called the Dancing Monster. You put your hand over a sensor, the monster moves, lights come up, sound happens. And if you grab the monster itself, you feel vibrations down your arm. And it was so impactful. You see these kids that don't have a lot of agency in their life, have that cause and effect, right? They were able to use technology to make something happen and feel like they were doing something. And it's such an important story, because we have this power of this technology in young kids, especially young kids with disabilities, to help them rewrite their stories, to help them feel empowered.
And also, Goa, what I love about the story that you're sharing is that it's a beautiful example of inclusive education. I believe that every child has different needs, and all those need to be supported. But the more we see differences in other kids, the more normalized we are, and the more empathetic we are for our broader society.
Yeah, and more fun. I mean, highlight reel replay of your parenting moments. I think that's gonna be so much fun at like family gatherings, especially like when you have siblings and everyone sits together and compare. Okay, why did they get preferential treatments? But yeah, I love the relational concept that we keep bringing up here, the relational tech and relational intelligence, RQ. So We'd love to get more into how you would define that. What's so special about being relational, and what's an example of having good or high relational intelligence?
Yeah. And let me go back a little bit about some very, very basic foundational aspects of brain science. So we are all born billionaires. We have literally billions of neurons in our brain, but those neurons are not connected when we are born. Or some are connected, but very few. So most of those, what is called synaptic connections, so those connections among those billions of neurons, are occurring in the very early years of life. And the few years, and really the few months, but few first years of life are where most of this growth in our brain is taking place. So 90% of our brain develops before age 5. And those synaptic connections happen mostly through human interactions. So when we are born as babies, we are essentially, and it's very different from other species, by the way, we are born dependent on others to feed our brains essentially with social connections. So the implications are profound. Sadly, there are some examples where children have been deprived of the essential human connections, where we can observe the negative impact on the brain, very sadly, at scale. And so there's been a lot of research on what is called the Romanian orphanages, which is very, very sad period in history in the 1980s and 90s in Romania, enrolled in those institutions with very little human care, and where scientists have observed the impact on the brains and essentially showed that brains are, in average, 10 to 15% smaller and also far less powerful. So those synaptic connections that I was mentioning are not taking place as much as they could in normalized environments. So I'm just mentioning that those studies just to highlight the importance of human connections in the very early years of life.
And there's something like I've talked about it earlier, this ineffable quality of human connection. And the problem with that is that it's so easy to say, well, math, we know how that works. We know how this is going to get you a job. We know how science works. We know how these are hard skills that maybe one country needs to develop versus another country. We know that this is going to get you into this school. That's when arts and communication and social gets diminished because we're so focused on checking these boxes. So it's such an interesting storytelling challenge that you grapple with in early education is how do you prove the importance of an ineffable quality? I don't know how to attack that. How do you look at that? How do you try to explain, yes, it's not math, it's not science, it's not computer science. All of that's important, but there's something about human connection that is so important in your childhood education.
Yeah, so I think there are at least two levels of needs here. One is a change in mindset, which is what I'm so excited about right now with this book and the writing that I'm doing, trying to reframe and highlight the importance of relational intelligence to be even more important than IQ. So, we have had IQ for a long time, or GPA, or that we were discussing earlier, or testing. What if we were to reframe and say that actually there is something even more important than those concepts, which is RQ? So changing the mindset is what I'm focused on right now. But I think there is a sister concept that needs to also rise, which is how to measure connections. So there are lots of measures that exist already on, for example, a concept of attachment or the concept of bonding or emotional connection. So there are some measures that exist. However, and that's where I've been so surprised about in my research for this book, is how little there is on, for example, very simple things on. So we know that not only the strength of relationship, but also the number of relationships matter in a child growth. So there is, for example, an amazing study by the Search Institute that showed that the higher the number of strong connections a high schooler has, the greater the academic performance of that child is, and the better the social emotional outcomes are. It's really clear. So you see this chart and you see, one strong connection is a little bit better, two is even stronger, three is even higher, and so forth, okay? Very linear and very, very strong correlation between the two. However, we don't really know right now. If I were to ask any high school, how many connections does a child has? We don't know. We don't track it. We are not observing it. We are not paying attention to it. It's almost like we've known for a long time that relationships matter, for any one of us to thrive, but we are not paying attention to it. This elephant in the room that it's very, very intuitive, that it matters, but we have neglected it at the expense of other things that we are tracking, such as, academic performance in maths or literacy, as you were explaining so well.
We spent so much time, I want to say in the 70s and 80s, in these high school movies we saw, where the popular kid is the one that flames out of college. And the nerds, the geeks who focused and didn't have a lot of friends are the ones who thrived. And because we live in those extremes, it's so easy for someone to say, oh, don't prioritize parties, don't prioritize social life, focus on education, which is something I did a lot in high school. I focused on my education. I didn't focus on my social life. But I have learned over the years that it was more about balance. It was more about living a balanced life than being extreme in any direction. And I think that has a lot to do with the stories we consume, the stories we're told, the movies we watch. I think we need to get into a more healthy idea of what it's like to be a emotionally intelligent kid, not just a smart or not just an impressive kid.
Exactly. And in the early years, this translates a lot in this debate right now on play. So play has been regressing in our society. So, for example, a child who is born today is playing about half less outdoors than their parent. And play is critical for a child to develop emotionally and relationally, of course, because that's how you make friends. That's how you test boundaries of social connections. And that's actually increasingly shown as not only helpful from a social and relational perspective, but also very helpful academically. So there is something that happens cognitively that also is really helpful through play. However, because of our focus in education on academic outcomes, we're saying, well, let's, ensure that a child knows their ABCs and let's ignore play. Whereas play is a way you develop creativity and imagination and relationships and all your social connections and all these synaptic connections that I was describing earlier are happening through play when a child is playing. So the problem is that we are not observing it as clearly as maybe when we teach the ABCs. So it's a more indirect evolution of a child's brain, but much more critical than simply the academic outputs.
I'm biased, obviously, but I see it as a storytelling problem. Like, I just finished Jonathan Haidt's book, Anxious Generation, and he talks about play a lot in that book.
Yeah.
And one of the biggest things about kids in play is this: they learn how to communicate, they learn how to share, they learn how to negotiate, they learn how to deal with problems. They learn how to relate to one another, these stories that you can't teach in school. And that's incredibly important.
Precisely plays a critical driver of relationships and again of also academic outcomes. So playing equals learning.
That's one of the important ways to get kids to love to learn, which fittingly is the title of your new book. What are some of the ways that we should rebuild learning? How do we get our kids to love to learn?
I would like our future education systems to move away from this tagline that says we need education to be learner-centered, to move away from that altogether and to say, no, we need our education systems to be relationship-centered. And ideally, this love to learn would come from, these human connections, this playful, active learning, joyful settings that kids can be exposed to, that can create more compassionate, inclusive, and ideally impactful learning experiences.
For our closing segment, Suspenders, this is where we ask you a fun, random question that really could be about anything, and you can give us any fun, random answer you feel like. Question of the day is, what is one book you've read that has changed your mindset about life?
I think one that changed my mindset is called The Book of Joy. So The Book of Joy is a series of interviews with two of our greatest human leaders on this planet. And this is a conversation between those two and a set of reflections about the concept of joy. And this is an incredible take on how to frame joy at an individual and societal level, and how to build more joy around each other's, and certainly starting with oneself.
Well, thank you so much for joining us today. We learned so much. We're very excited for your new book, Love to Learn. Thank you for teaching us about the storytelling behind early education. Welcome to Top Hat. This is the part of the episode where we dissect and analyze some of the cool and amazing insights we got from this week's expert storyteller. And this week, we talked to someone amazing. Isabelle is someone who spends all her time thinking about education, thinking about how we can connect with the youngest and the most vulnerable people and help them, educate them, and teach them to be leaders of our society. And it's funny, I've been in therapy for like 8 years now, coming up on 9. One thing you do in therapy, and you do this in life in general, is think about why you are who you are, right? Tracing back the connections. And a lot of it comes from, your childhood. Why are you interested in the goals you have? Why are you in the career you are? A lot of it has something to do with childhood. I mean, the joke is that if you tell a young kid they're good at something, that's going to become their whole career. Talk to singers, actors, whatever. Someone, when they were young, told them they were good at this, and that inspired them to work hard to become good at this. I'm not saying that it wasn't hard work, but when you are told you're good at something, or you are encouraged when you're young, it inspires you to work hard towards it. So education, the stories we tell them, the ways we connect with them, the ways we use storytelling in education is almost the most important thing to think about when building a future society.
The way you get encouragement, you get acknowledgement that eventually fuels you to pursue certain goals and careers in life, it has to come from the fact that you have built strong connections and relationships with other people. And there is this risky story in our society right now that Isabelle talked about here, is that adopting technology can create more divides between children. There can be a world where only the most privileged children can get access to human teachers and have that human interaction and connection and build their relational intelligence. Whereas for the rest of the children, we just put AI on them to teach them things. Technology should enhance human connection rather than replace it. And I think that is a very crucial narrative that we should keep in mind in education, of course, but also for really the world at large, because there are so many different fields right now that we're seeing new and exciting technology can really accelerate. But in what ways are we improving the experience of people? And are we actually able to build better human connections with the introduction of this technology? I think that's an important story to investigate there.
And those are so important. Like the stories we tell about AI is going to shape how we build AI, right? The ways we think about AI, the dangers we overestimate because they've been told in media versus the dangers we underestimate because they haven't been explored as much in movies or books. That's going to shape how we build and how we use AI and how it's going to hurt and unlock us. And that kind of brings us to another huge point we talked about in this episode. And it's this idea of how education is changing. It's not just how we're using technology, it's how we're thinking about education. We've spent a lot of time, I think studies have shown, planning for our kids, as a society where our kids have action-packed, tight schedules full of very quantitative things like my kid's learning Chinese, my kid's in math camp, my kid's doing extra math, my kid's doing the STEM stuff because it's important and it is important. But the importance of play, of relational education, of just having free time where kids can play with each other, learn from each other, connect with each other, unstructured, not learning math, not learning science, just learning how to communicate, how to tell stories to one another, and create mini societies, right? And that type of education, we talked about a lot with Isabelle, is so important, even if it's harder to see the direct benefits from it right away. Because like math, like of course you can see right away, bam, that's huge. But with play, it's kind of hard to say, well, they learned how to share today. That's the story they learned. There are aspects of it that's harder to quantify, but may make a better society. There's something about being human that kids will learn if we allow them to play, if we allow them outside, if we find ways to make technology an asset and not a replacement.
And for those of you who have been in one of those career panels at University for Young Professionals, you're probably very familiar with this conversation that what are some of the crucial skills that allow you to succeed in this particular professional field? And the answer is almost always communication and things in that nature that aren't necessarily the academic, the technical knowledge that you're learning in school. And I think that really speaks to this phenomenon that we're talking about here, what's been kind of missing, where we should really think about revamping the story of our education. What are the essential skills that our children should be learning besides what we're already focusing so much on? And this has been another great episode of the Learning Student Plastic Type podcast. If you like our show, make sure to subscribe and follow wherever you listen. Leave us a comment or review to let us know what you're thinking. Go to lsptpod.com to find us on Instagram, LinkedIn, TikTok, and stay updated on our latest updates.
Thank you for taking the time to learn today. To our storytellers out there just trying to become better at this, we're all learning. We appreciate you.